Well, so we're continuing today in Mishna Yomi. We find ourselves in Maseches Demai, Perek Dalid. Mishnah is Dalid through Hey, chapter 4. Mishnah is 4 through 5. So Mishnah Dalid says as follows: Misha Karashim l'Trumas Meiser Shel Demai u'Lemeiser Ani Shel Vadai Lo Yitleim b'Shabbos. So remember, again, we've spoken about already before that halacha l'Maisa, one is not permitted to go ahead and separate out Trumas and Meisers on Shabbos. In this case over here, what's happened as follows. The situation is, this is someone who has designated Trumas Meiser of Demai or Meiser Ani of Vadai, which means, again, produce that's definitely Tevel. Now, interestingly enough, we're talking about situations over here where the particular tithes have already been designated before Shabbos. So the designation occurred on Shabbos, but halacha l'maisi, he didn't actually separate out the tithes from the produce. So what's the halacha? Lo yitleim b'Shabbos. One is not permitted to actively separate them, to remove them on Shabbos. Now, remember again, the idea over here is why? Because we're concerned, even though technically speaking, it was separated, it was designated before Shabbos. So in reality, since it was designated before Shabbos, there really shouldn't be a problem with going ahead and separating it on Shabbos. But we're concerned about this as follows: that if we allow you to actively remove it, even though it's been designated before Shabbos, you may come to actually go ahead and take Trumas and Meisers on Shabbos. In a different vein, now here's what's interesting. What happens if a person normally has a particular kohen or a particular pauper over at his home to eat? So one might have thought that halacha l'maisa. See, let's take a step back. In general, Chazal said that one should not go ahead and have a kohen or an ani or pauper over on Shabbos in order to give them the tithes, right? And remember again that halacha l'maisa, the problem with this is that if somebody sees this, they would assume that you just separated out the Trumas and Meisers in order to be able to give it to the kohen or be able to give it to the ani. Therefore, to avoid that, Chazal said you can't separate, you can't invite an ani or a kohen over on Shabbos to eat from Truma or from Meiser Ani. Mishna's case is what happens if there is a kohen who normally comes to eat at my house. So I have someone who comes, a kohen who comes often to eat at my house, or an ani, a poor person who often comes to eat at my house. What's the halacha? Yavo v'yoklu. You could have them over on Shabbos. Il bilvad sheyodi'eim. Now, interestingly enough, halacha l'maisa, that now this is very interesting. There's a couple of things happening over here. So what the Mishnah is saying firstly is that halacha l'maisa in general, a person shouldn't just invite over an ani or a kohen to eat tithes at his home on Shabbos, because the concern is a maris ayin. It looks like a person has, or perhaps it'll look like a person has actively separated the tithes on Shabbos itself, which of course is problematic. The Mishnah's case is where, let's say, somebody normally comes over to my house, an ani, right, a poor person or a kohen comes to my house on a regular basis. So the halacha is they could come and they could go ahead and eat, but I have to tell them that what I'm giving them to eat ultimately, again, is the truma or the Meiser Ani. Now, again, remember that, so in this case, I've separated it out and designated and separated it before Shabbos. When they come over to my house and they eat, I have to tell them that they are eating of the Truma and the Meiser Ani. Now, what's the reason for that? Now, this is really quite fascinating. The Bartanura explains that the issue over here is that halacha l'maisa, they will be indebted to me. They'll feel a sense of gratitude because they may think that they are eating of my food, right? And halacha l'maisa, in fact, that's not the case. They're eating of the truma and of the Meiser Ani. I have to tell them this because if they think they're eating of my food, then ultimately they will have a sense of hakaras hatov, a sense of gratitude for me, because they think that I'm doing something nice for them. When in fact, I'm not actually doing anything specifically nice for them. I'm simply giving them that which they are correctly entitled to. So ultimately, again, the concern is that if they feel indebted to me, they may do something for me in return. And halacha l'maisa, the Trumas and Meisers are supposed to be given as a debt that is paid, and ultimately not as a gift. So in this interesting situation, halacha l'maisa, if they're coming over to my house, I have to tell them, by the way, the food that I'm giving you is Truma, is Meiser Ani. Incredible. Says Mishna, hey, interesting case. I say to Ruvain, right there, I go over to a guy, I say Ruvain, and now Ruvain himself is a person who does not have credibility in terms of Trumas and Maestros. Right? So he's an Amaretz. So I say to Ruvain, Kachli mimishu neman, do me a favor, go out and purchase produce from me, but make sure to only buy from someone who you know is careful with Trumas and Maestros. So what's the halacha? Umimishu ma'aser, and someone who takes meiser from his produce. So what's the halacha? Ruvain goes, he buys produce, he comes back, eno ne'aman. He is not believed to say that he bought it from a credible source. Now, again, the idea is, there's simple logic. Since Ruvain's an Amaretz, and an Amaretz doesn't have credibility regarding his own produce, he's certainly not going to have credibility to go out and purchase for me permitted produce. However, if I say to Ruvain, now remember, the difference in the first case is that I'm just telling Ruvain to go to someone. I'm not giving him anyone specific. So the Mishnah says if you don't give him specific directions, you cannot assume he's going to go ahead and purchase tithed produce. However, if I say to Ruvain, I want you to go to Shimon and purchase produce from Shimon, because Shimon is a trustworthy guy, then Harei ze ne'eman. Then when Ruvain comes back with produce, he is believed to say that halacha l'maaseh he bought it from Shimon. And again, that's because in case number 2, I gave him explicit directions. Halach likach mimenu. So listen to this. So let's say Ruvain goes to Shimon to buy the produce. Va'amar lo matzasiv. And then ultimately, again, Ruvain comes back and he says, listen, I went to Shimon like you told me, but I couldn't find Shimon. But don't worry about it. I found Levi, and Levi, I bought produce from Levi, and Levi is also a trustworthy guy, so I ended up getting you proper produce. What's the halacha? Eino ne'eman. Ultimately, again, Ruvain is not believed. So what you see come out from the Mishnah is as follows, which makes sense. Once Ruvain, an Amaretz, doesn't have credibility regarding his own produce, what the Mishnah essentially says is like this: if he procures me produce from any source that I am not 100% knowledgeable about, then halacha l'maaseh I cannot trust that is from a properly tithed source. But if I give him explicit instructions to buy from a particular person, and he complies with those instructions, in other words, I could trust the fact that he's complying with my explicit instructions. And halacha l'maaseh could assume that in fact he went ahead and he bought it from the person I told him to buy it from. But if I told him to go to Shimon, and he says, I looked for Shimon, but I couldn't find Shimon, but don't worry, I found Levi. Again, purchasing produce from anything other than the explicitly articulated source, Ruvain, the Amaretz, who is the agent, is not going to be believed. Okay, Shkach, we'll stop over here for today. We'll continue tomorrow. Mishnah is Vav and Zayin. Have a wonderful day.